I'm Patrice. I'm the editor of A Phoenix First Must Burn, 16 stories of Black girl magic, resistance, and hope. I'm also the writer of Letting the Right One In, and this is Danny, who wrote Tenderheaded, and this is Ashley, who wrote The Curse of Love. And we're here today to basically talk about all things related to this anthology, some of our favorite books, our childhoods, and lots of magic. So basically, when I was, coming up with the idea for this anthology, it was kind of like I really felt that I wanted a few things. One, a book that I didn't have growing up. Something where I could go to and see Black characters in sci-fi and fantasy and things like that. I was like a Star Trek and Star Wars nerd, and there were very few. There's what Mace Windu. There's very few characters that actually exist when I was younger. And then also, the title comes from Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents. And for me, as I talk about in the introduction, I read Wild Seed as a teen, and I just fell in love, and I kind of continue to read all of her work. More and more and more, I've been thinking about just how important it is to have this anthology, and how amazing it's going to be to have Black teens get to pick this up and be like, oh my God, this is something, there's vampires, there's witches, there's girls falling in love, and there's all this stuff. It's a magical, powerful anthology.
It's one of the best parts of it for me, and not to suck up, but this is actually a contextual thing.
Oh my gosh.
Is literally literally knowing that you were going to edit it, because one, I've been able to blatantly talk race with you.
Yeah. We've had some really good conversations.
Yeah.
That's the best part about this.
Even before jumping onto this,
Yeah.
we've had conversations both in terms of just what's on the shelf, the industry, things like that. There's a universe where I tried to write this story, but it's not called Tenderheaded because the editor wouldn't have understood that.
Right.
What that meant.
Right.
Just that having the sentence in there, you're not tender-headed, doesn't make you touch your scalp.
Yeah.
There's certain things about that story that I could not have tried to do with other people because they would not have understood the nuances of what that story was doing. And I think that there's a lot of stories in here like that we're able to do certain things because we knew that it was going to be you giving us notes and and that you would understand that just the little things that maybe someplace else they might say cut this out because it's not
but it is
essential, but it is. It's so essential.
Yeah, in my story, I have just a little bit of AAVE, the aunt, just that's just the way she talks.
Yeah.
And I remember I sent it to someone, and they were like, oh, they corrected it, and I was like, okay, you were not the right person to send this story to. But I also think, sort of going back to when you were talking about thinking about what you would have wanted when you were younger, and I think this this continues to be a theme, I think, throughout my life, but you just don't see Black women as the object of anyone's affection, ever, in movies, in TV shows, and you're seeing, I think now we're getting to the point where you're seeing a lot more Black men in relationships, but white women are always,
it's not even another person of color. I'm at least there are other types of interracial relationships.
Right, but it's always.
Or you get Black women's bodies as the center of affection or attention, but not the Black women themselves.
Exactly.
And that was one of the things that I when I was rereading yours in particular, that I like, that it's
women
you get both you get her being the stunner that's gonna tear the roof down, but that's not where it ends.
And I also wanted the women to be in the position of power in the stories.
I love it. It's their choice.
It's their choice. They are the ultimate. They are ultimately the ones that decide what their own fate is, and that was so really, really important to me because you just don't get.
So still being someone who works in retail, still on the side where I'm in the shop and people come to me for recommendations. My favorite thing on the planet is black queer women, sometimes teenagers, sometimes college, early 20s stuff, and they're just looking for queer and brown books, and me being I have a memorized list that updates daily, literally updates every Tuesday. And it's so nice to be part of a project that's adding more to that. That's just what I want to do. I'm just like, there's a bunch of brown queer folk and we're doing stuff, and it's
Pay attention to us.
pay attention. but also some of them just don't have access to finding it, especially when they're on the younger end. Just think about it when they go to their schools and their libraries, unless you're fortunate to have a school that like backs finding those books, it's difficult for them to find. So having this book, one of the reasons I love anthologies in general is if someone's like just starting out in genre stuff or something like that, handing it to them and being like, virtually every writer in this either has a novel I will recommend to you next or is probably going to in the next couple of years.
Right.
So like being like, you come to me next time and tell me what your favorite story from this book is, and I'm gonna hook you up. Writing Jaylene was like a bit of an adventure because as someone who is non-binary and does primarily use like they, them, still writing about people like me is still new territory for me. And like figuring out how to construct sentences, how to do, like I think I intentionally only give like Jaylene like one bit of physical description in the whole thing, and it was intentionally something that it's just like, well, I'm still not like gendering on like on a very intentional level. Partially because I also just I kind of wanted the non-binary partner to like be kind of the comfort space in that, like that was like very much why I chose
well, they totally are.
them to be that role instead of the non-binary character being the protagonist. But like, which is also always its kind of own minefield, whether or not like they're secondary characters or not. But like, so I was going through the experience of, I think this is actually the very first story I ever wrote with that I allowed myself to have an important like non-binary character, where like I was figuring out in prose how to write someone.
That's so hard.
But I love that we actually had to have that conversation, you know, and it was a conversation.
I love like,
and I really appreciate when you were like told me that you felt like you were heard in the conversation.
Yeah, like it was getting like emails or chatting with you where you were making sure that I was being seen and that the editorial process was not harmful. Like that meant so much. So the thing is, for me, like I know on a professional level, like I have like leaned on you for like advice and support in a lot of ways, being able to identify what is and isn't a door. And I feel like in some ways that is what this book being on the shelf is to a lot of like young readers who might potentially be writers. It is a door that otherwise they didn't realize existed. And like that's what I love about just the concept of this, that like had I seen this on the shelf when I was younger next to my Babysitter's Club and like Nancy Drew stuff, which is like what I like grew up with, like that would have been life-changing for me. Like life-changing in a way that honestly, on a literary scale, I feel like only happened to me in the past 4 or 5 years.
Yep. Hard same.
Yeah.
No,
reading, it was like Daniel Jose Older, it was Victor Laval, it was Justina.
When I was an editor in 2018, okay, so in 2018, 3 YA books that were by Black women hit the bestseller list. So it's like Children, Blood and Bone, The Bells by Danielle Clayton, and then Justina Ireland's Dread Nation, right? And so this sold before that. And I remember, like, none of them, like, it was one of those things where I remember, like, literally Danielle hit the list the day this book went to like auction, and I was like, and I like already had put New York Times bestseller in the proposal because I was like wishful, and I was like so glad we don't have to delete that. I was like instant New York Times bestseller, but like that's one of those things where like it was like so much pressure was on the 3 of them, because like those books were like writing, and I remember as an editor, like I kid you not, it had to be like. These people, that's how you know people have these manuscripts waiting. Like the moment these books hit the list, I got such an influx of like books by Black women that were fantasy novels. Like that I never.
And I had never seen books like those books.
No,
like The Bells. Like there was nothing like that when I was growing up. Dread Nation.
My sister's copy of The Bells has it annotated. Like I sent it to Danielle. Like she literally annotated the entire book because she just like it's like. To her, it's like a masterpiece,
And to see those all like come out at the same time, to be on the list, like that was world changing for me because that really goes like, you know, like I open, you know, like one of Justina's books, and even though like it's, you know, like Civil War period, like the way those characters talk, like they legit sometimes sound more like the people I grew up with than like some of the other YA books that like I'm reading up there. Or when I read like Poet X, you know, and I had never read, like I'm the sort of person who always goes, I can't read poetry, like I'm very bad at it. But like I got to hear Elizabeth like read the first chapter out loud once, and then I was like, this is what this is.
Book by topic.
Because like she was one of the keynotes for the Bronx Book Fest.
Yeah.
And so she read that first chapter, and I went, oh, I get this.
I mean, but I even like, you know, we've had this conversation like how like your debut had like all this music, you know, and stuff, and the element of like just having like Black teens be like ordinary, you know, and this thing of like, I feel like you never see that, you know, you never see like Black teens who are just like, yeah, like I'm dealing with like loss and grief, and I'm getting to grieve and like make, it's just like, wow, what a concept.
To be normal.
It's like your life is not threatened. You're just going through like, I lost somebody. Wow, like relatable.
That was sort of what I wanted when I was younger, because I feel like all the books that I read that had Black characters in them, they were either like, it was either like slavery, segregation, or the projects.
And I had already read the Meet Addie books from Pleasant Company, so I didn't need any of that.
I loved Sarah Dessen, right?
Yeah. Same.
Because those girls were going through the things that I was going through. Like those were the kinds
like,
of
they were just so like ordinary.
Right, and those girls, you know, like their parents are getting divorced. They're like
dealing
in
with
a weird
depression.
relationship. They like have friends who have eating disorders, or like, you know, just like regular stuff.
I mean, like honestly, like to get like serious. I mean, like I have always like when I was younger, I had like a lot of like disordered eating, and like reading her books, I was like, oh, like this is what this is, like, you know.
Yeah.
And it's like weird.
But
that,
you
like,
never see a Black girl who was dealing with any of that
who
stuff.
wasn't like, oh, I'm pregnant, and I'm not gonna make.
I'm pregnant, and my dad is like a drug lord.
Like and like I'm about to get like, and oh my God, the gunshots boom 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 outside my door. I'm like, what is this life?
I was always really genre to my heart, like real hardcore, and like, but even if there were black characters there, they didn't sound like people I knew.
No, but also like it's like that kind of genre, that Black sci-fi fantasy genre of the time we were growing up, is a special like language almost. You know, even Octavia Butler's books, I feel like they have, it's very much that 80s like sci-fi fantasy kind of feel.
You know, and so it's wild to me to look and, you know, like even on the non-speculative fiction level, like I was finishing up reading Let Me Hear a Rhyme by Tiffany Jackson the other day, and like that is literally like it's I mean, like for people who don't know it, it's essentially a 90s thriller version of Weekend at Bernie's.
But
that's
it's
how,
like, but it's so her voice is so like.
But then, like, she has a flashback to like first of all, the way that those kids talk to each other, I was like, that's me and my cousins. Like I know that, but they're.
She talks about how hard it was.
Yeah, we
not
had a whole
to use the
conversation.
N-word.
Yeah. This is something I deal with like all the time. But like, that book is allowed to be a thriller with a death at the center that has a flashback to the kids watching like Biggie's procession.
Right.
You know, like, you know, stories like that, you know, where I'm like, oh, it's not just like, because you had stories that were in the projects, but they weren't stories in the projects where kids got to have
happiness
or just capital A adventure.
But that's the thing,
you know,
though, it's like it's not like we're not saying. I mean, even like I was saying with Liz's, like we're not saying don't ever give me like a slavery story. It's just like I don't want them all to be like yes, Amasa, my name Toby. Like
I want them to feel like they were written for me to read.
Like Roots is phenomenal. I will say this. Roots is phenomenal. But
I know.
Like, it's
I so often feel like they're not meant for me to read.
This is the key. It's written with the white gaze.
Yes.
It's not written for.
Right, you know, like where a thing for me is I grew up in Harlem, Manhattanville projects, and so very much during that period of the start of the gentrification of the neighborhood. I'm still in mourning. Last fall, that McDonald's from the Jay-Z song closed.
Was that the McDonald's? Like
Yeah, no, that's my McDonald's. Like literally, I can see it from my window.
Yeah.
And like that song, like we would always, you know, have like that kind of like hood pride of, you know, like meet me at that McDonald's. Like you knew, and like I went up to visit my mom the other day, and it's like totally blocked off. You know, like walled off. Like the building's still there because it's a very it is the arch. But you know, like, and you're seeing all that gentrification. And for me, like I wanted to. A lot of why I write, how I write, why I would do something like a hood version of like a Greek myth is specifically recording that culture that I knew, like that I grew up with, that is slowly being pushed out. That I lived a life where literally there was always a contention between the nearby university, who technically owns the land up there for all those projects. So there's literally always been a threat as I grew up of us literally being pushed out.
You know, I think
so it informs my writing in such a way where it's like, as someone who writes speculative, I want to record the world that I grew up in, the people that I grew up in, but they deserve a world in which their stuff is magical.
You do a thing, it becomes a book, cool. Because I've done this so many times as like an actor, it's like, I guess for the first time I'm actually like, oh yeah, this is kind of unique, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is.
Yes.
It's very unique.
Like this is like, for me, like almost like a tome of like, of voices, like as opposed to like just like a book, you know?
Well,
It is, because of its rarity, it is a record, you know, as opposed to like a book on the shelf. It is a record of our voices in a time that multiple of us are making the bestseller list at the same time, but at the same time still struggling to be able to go, look, my pitch isn't Game of Thrones meets Black Panther, but it's still good.
Like, so the book, I pitched it as, because I was like, in publishing, I was like, when we sell this book, we have to frame it, you know? It has to be really framed so that the moment people go into reading it, and it was a struggle because I was thinking of comp titles, and I was like, what are all these white people in publishing going to know? So I was like, Octavia Butler meets Beyonce's Lemonade, but also because similarly, I was like, in my head, I was like, okay, I would love for it to be like, obviously not like shared characters, but like almost like a linked story, like how Lemonade, she's like telling a story about like her life as a Black Southern woman. It's like, okay, like what if each of these are telling a story about like Blackness and Black womanhood and being Black and queer and all this stuff, you know? So I was having calls with a lot of editors who like know me, but like I think some people, and it's totally fine. I think Black Panther must have just come out or what came out around that time and people were still talking about it. So many people were like, oh my God, this is like Black Panther the book. And I was like, next. Because it was just like not, it was like, and I get what you mean.
See, I'm a troll, so
it.
I couldn't be in that conversation because I would do my retail smile and go, what do you mean?
No, I mean,
like just full on like.
But some people were like,
no
they were
way.
like, oh, it's like this, and you're like, and it was, but then it hits you. You're like, oh.
That's their point of reference.
Yeah. That's it.
And that's the only one that they have.
That's the only one. So like
touchstone.
for me, I'm thinking even Lemonade. I'm like, oh, like I just thought Beyonce was that big that everyone, you know. But it's like people are like Black Panther, and I was like, right, Octavia Butler. Black Panther's bigger than Octavia Butler, you know. And it's so.
Ouch. Ouch.
I mean, like, you know, and so it's like.
But it's true.
But I'm so thankful there's like a Black woman. Black Panther's phenomenal. I love it. But it's like, first of all, that's like secondary world pseudo. It's like sci-fi fantasy. It's
Afrofuturism.
It's Afrofuturism, which
it's
this
weird.
is not. You know, it's like, and so I really appreciated that. Like, that is not anywhere on this cover.
My parents were very good at getting me like Black picture books and stuff like that. So like, it was not strange to see Black characters, but I didn't, because a lot of my sci-fi and fantasy exploration was solo without someone kind of guiding me. I actually didn't, I didn't get the privilege of growing up with reading Octavia's work. I only again, like I was saying, my big getting into Black sci-fi and fantasy in particular, as opposed to Black literature as a whole, only happened the past few years. And so I was very curious to hear a little bit more about her impact on both this project, but you know, like you guys' work.
You know, I've always been obsessed with vampires. This does relate to Octavia. And so she wrote this book called Fledgling, which is like this like book where basically in their world, like there's like vampirism. And with these vampires basically were like, oh, like, how do we like create the perfect vampire who can like withstand the sun? And it's like having Black skin, you know, like brown skin, stuff like that. So was so, I think that plus like Blade, like I was just so fascinated by this idea of like that Blackness could like actually like be like a strength, you know? And I think that's something that I love so much about her work, you know, and all of her work, she just was like, she thought about these things. Like she was like, oh, I'm going to make like Black people. I mean, like Kindred, which is this book, which is like, whew, it's like, right, it's like a work of art. Like Kindred is like this book where it's like this woman, Black woman is like basically flitting back and forth between time, and she's flitting back between like her like slave ancestors and roots, and she's meeting all these people in her past and all this stuff, like not her past, but like her like, you know, family's past. And it's fascinating because it is both incredibly brutal because it's rough. I mean, like, you know, so it's like, how do you show the effects of slavery on a modern day Black woman? Like, how do you relate slavery, like how we were talking about like reading all these things and just being like, that's not my experience. Like, so how do you relate slavery to like the modern day person? Right. But then also like, how do you tell like this beautiful story, epic story about slavery that's actually like brutal but also beautiful, you know? And I think that to me was the first time that I was like, oh, like kind of you said, writing for you, I realized like I just have been reading like the wrong stuff. You know, it's like I totally didn't even think about the fact that like I could write things that were about and for Black people and explore like traumas. And she explored it through magic and sci-fi. Like she explored like the strengths and stuff. For me, it was like we were thinking of a title, and originally the book was called like Storytellers and Heroines and Tricksters. Obviously that's not the title. And I just started going through Octavia Butler quotes and like started thinking about it. It says, in order to rise from its own ashes, a phoenix first must burn. And I kind of talked about in the introduction how that so much relates to like Blackness, the idea of like I say here, you know, Black women are phoenixes, we're given lemons and make lemonade, which of course is a reference to Lemonade because she has that statement in like the album, you know, and the idea of like taking, you know, reinventing yourself. And I feel like there's so many people I know in my life, you know, where you're like trying and trying again and never giving up. Like, I mean, I think, you know, when you look at the anthology, it starts right from like Amory's story. It's like from like, and then, it starts from Amory's story, goes to Liz's, it's like slavery, and you're like, you know, we've had to like kind of reinvent ourselves. We could have given up at any point, you know, and the fact that we're like still here. And I think to me, like that's what this is all about.
For me, I also came to Octavia Butler's work later as an adult. And to me, I think it was sort of part of my, I guess I should back up. When I was younger, I also had a library full of picture books that had Black characters in them. My mother would even go so far as coloring in people on cards and whatever. You know, before the mahogany line came out, like, you know, like if she gave me a card,
I had all
the Black Barbies that like.
I had the Black Barbies. Like I remember I wanted these Barbie sheets so bad, and my mom would not buy them because she couldn't find the Black ones.
I had all the retold fairy tales where they had
I had that too.
That line.
Yes,
that line of the picture
I never
books.
know anyone who do this is so
And
cool.
so
had
like,
that
for me,
too.
it's this weird experience where like I never had I didn't grow up with the we're missing.
Right.
It's just the way
it's just the where are we? For me, it was more that there was like this gap between things that were for me when I was a kid and things that were for me when I was an adult. And I was in this limbo space where there was nothing.
Yeah, because especially as a kid, like all those fairy tales and folk tales, like, you know, that was part of it. Like I grew up knowing that we had magic and stuff like that and all these stories, but then like as I got older, it just disappeared. It was like my like picture books, all these things, and then like middle grade, I mean, I think about like Tristan Strong, and like Tristan Strong punches a hole in the sky. You know, it's like literally
but there was all the middle grade stuff was like the Watsons Go to Birmingham, and like those books are important. When I found Octavia Butler, it was like a light went on, kind of, because it was like, oh wait, like you can write about all of this terrible shit that has happened, but you can do it in a way that sort of gives back the power that was taken away from us.
Such a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, and like reading.
I mean, you feel empowered reading her stuff. Like
reading
no matter
her
how
stuff,
much you go
through, you feel like oh, you feel like this, right? You feel like I'm literally rising from the ashes because you know you can't really change. You can't change history.
Right.
You can sort of only decide where you go from here.
I'd love to like just talk about your stories and like kind of like your inspirations behind them.
My story is called The Curse of Love. I was actually talking to another contributor, Danielle Clayton, about short stories and how to write them.
Yeah.
And she said that
She's such a short story pro.
yeah, she's an amazing craft person in general, but I was having a lot of trouble with short stories in general because it was something that I wanted to do more of, but I was having a hard time. And this conversation actually happened before this anthology was happening. But she said that whenever she's writing a short story, she thinks about a central question. What's the central question that your story is trying to answer? And she said usually if you come up with that question, it's much easier to structure the rest of your story around. And so a question that has plagued me for the majority of my life is, I mean, lots of those exist, but the one that is significant to the conversation we're having right now is what is the cost of love? Like, how much is love worth? And because I normally don't write genre fiction, I wanted to come up with a way that love was sort of linked to some kind of ultimate sacrifice.
Right.
And so
that's like the curse.
That's the curse. Yeah, that's the curse of falling in love.
Yeah. There are all these stories about like, mine's about like two, it's like two girls. So there's one girl who's human. She basically like meets this girl in like the vampire, like the Anne Rice section of our library, and then through a series of circumstances, she's like, oh, I think this person's like a vampire, and then they kind of like, you know, like it's like she's having like family drama stuff at home, and then like the interesting thing of like figuring out like, oh, like do I take a chance with this person that I feel all these great things about, but all my life I've just played by the rules, you know? And so I think like it's so interesting, like all these stories, because I think when you're a teen, you definitely have these like sorts of things, you know? Like, I mean, I love how your story is like, it's like, instead of like, it's like a new relationship, yours is like, no, there's like actually like something good here, but it's more like how, what's that point when you realize you have something good, but maybe you're just you're like self-sabotaging, you know? And I kind of love that, and how it's like a hair-braiding twist. You want to tell us more about it?
So my story is called Tender-Headed. It kind of came out of my love of actually getting to see that particular Black hairstyling in stories, that on the rare occasions that I've actually gotten to see scenes that are centered around that, it just feels so much like home, you know, like, and me really just wanting the moment of a hot comb in anything.
So much happens, like,
as
like,
it should.
as like Black people, so much happens and goes down at like the hair salon. You know, like I get people's gossip.
Yeah.
You're like, oh wow, she got a divorce. Like, you know, like everything important happens in like the barbershop or the hair salon.
Yeah, like there's so much important about us doing our hair, and then our relationship to the person that does our hair in particular, because like these like
You're trusting them.
yeah, you know, whether it's your mother or whether it's someone down the block or whether like it's a full-blown professional, you know, these are people that are so important to our lives and also really affect how other people see us in a very real way. And then another thing that I'm very big on is your protagonist doesn't have to be the best person to be worthy of being liked and cared for.
Oh my God.
Like it's super important to me because there's especially like the discussions about respectability and things like that, and it's like as a teen, like sometimes you're just kind of a jerk.
Yeah.
Like,
oh my God,
yeah, you know, like, but
and
that
not
doesn't-
just as a teen,
Yeah, I mean,
Current
as
person.
a human.
but it also doesn't make you an antagonist, or it doesn't make you a
Right.
villain.
And it doesn't mean that you're not worthy of everything that you want.
Right.
We're not allowed to cry.
Don't cry.
You know,
It's not your fault.
But like, so all of that kind of came with me going, well, how do I tie this all into a story? And remembering my favorite like Greek myth. One of my favorites of all time is that like Athena versus like Arachne, like tapestry competition, you know, and how like, nah, she messed up opening her mouth. Like she was in the wrong, you know? So the myth essentially starts out with this young woman, Arachne, who's like this amazing, you know, like weaver and tapestry creator, and she starts basically talking out the side of her mouth, and she's like, to and about Athena, about how she's better than the goddess herself. And Athena's like, all right, cool, so competition. And
So clearly they're black.
this is how I retell all stories.
You like cheered in your voice. You kind of like settled into. You were like, all right, cool. I was like, so these are black.
Listen, the fact that I didn't say I bet is like a big like I guess like evolution in me varying my language. But so essentially by the end of that story, Athena turns Arachne into the first like spider. Yeah. And so she is cursed to forever weave. But when I hear the word weave, I don't think spiders, I don't think tapestry, right. I think hair. I think extensions, I think, that the amount of time my mom spent either gluing or sewing in a weave to my sister's hair, because I grew up, my mom did all of her hair. She does my locks now. Yeah. She does full on box braids.
I mean, so many moms, my mom
yeah.
did too. Yeah, like,
my mom went once to get my sister's hair braided and was like, this is too expensive, and like one of the braids was too heavy, so like a piece came out and she was like, never again.
Oh, my mom's so mad that my sister, like, who's 16, she goes to get her hair done. She has like locks, and my mom's like, I could do that for you.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, like, come on, let her live her grown life. Yeah. Like, it's like a mom thing.
Remembering all of that, like that's what weave means to me. Yeah. Right. So I was like, what if I told that story, but instead of Athena, instead of a blatant, goddess or, whatever, it's a witch/goddess ? Character, and I was like, who is that for us? Who is that for us, like in our neighborhoods? And that's an auntie. That's that woman you all knew that like your mom was like
magic. She got some stuff up in the
You're like, your parents never said the words, but they were like, you got to be extra nice to her, and so like
she'll put some curse and use some bad juju for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it's like, and you all have like the rumors of like the one person who pissed her off, and like that's why everything goes wrong in their life.
We're like, oh yeah, like that's why she can't get her life right. And like, one time she looked at her the wrong way, and you're like, okay.
And so like that's kind of like I was like, let's tell a story about that weaving, but let's tell it from the perspective of the girl, like Akila Lala, who has just been, consistently kind of burying her feelings about the role that she has with her family and her friends, into this kind of, I'm so good at what I do, I don't have to be decent to people.
No, I think it's like, and you so beautifully show that through all the flashbacks. Yeah. And I think that's what I kind of love about like all the stories in here. I mean, for sure, some of the stories are like magic, but I think it's like so interesting how many of us have like almost like sort of folk magic throughout, where it's not really explained, like even just like, why do vampires do this? No, it's just like a thing and you accept it, It's like, it's a thing and you accept it, and I think that's so true of like our culture. Like I know growing up in the South, for me, like there was so much magic around, or there were so many things and traditions where I just like felt like I believe in spirits and things like that. Where like it's just never been questioned. You feel like you're like, that's how it is.
That's a thing.
That's a thing. Like,
and I also think that that's particularly fun and important when doing short stories in particular. Like if I'm doing like a longer piece, I may feel the need to explain it. But one of the things that writing short stories really help with, like on the comics end, is that sometimes you don't need to explain it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is less believable if you explain it, because then you've given yourself holes that people can cling onto.
Talk more about that. It's like a crafting. So do you feel that like it was like, I mean, this might be hard, but do you feel like it was like easier to write a story than a comic, or do you feel like comics helped you write?
So I actually, prose is my first home, although like comics is really, like since I was literally would be on like my mom's floor, and she would collect all her like old Vogues and stuff like that and keep them for me, and I would sit on the floor with a pile larger than me and go through each one and like make a story that had to connect every piece of picture.
Oh my God, so you were meant to do an anthology.
That's what I would do as a kid. Like, and so prose was like is kind of my home. So like being able to do this was really fun. The hard thing for me was actually writing YA. I've never touched YA before. Like I've read it, but like as someone who kind of even as a kid was never intending to write that age group, like intentionally writing for that specific age group was like a big change for me.
How did you feel like you tapped into it? Like,
I had to curse a lot less. I cursed so much in all my writing, but
that's actually so funny because Kendra and I, who is my editor, we were actually talking about that because it just so happened. Like we kind of had this conversation being like, oh, we want, obviously this has like, YA, it definitely has crossover elements, but like we want it to also be like something that like younger teens can pick up, because, I think a lot of us feel like there's like not a lot of stuff always for younger teens, right? And so I remember she was like, So like I don't want to like obviously like ask anyone to like not like curse and stuff like that, but like do you know how many like F-bombs are to be dropped? And I was like, somebody's about to drop so many. But then we read the stories and I was like, oh
they
were
That's because I cut them out before sending them to you.
The other version is just like, beep, 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 beep,
I mean,
beep.
you've heard a 16-year-old girl from the hood when she's pissed. Like there was a lot of them. But like
My mother would still like pop me in the mouth if I cursed in front
Wash
of her
your mouth
now.
out with soap. Yeah. Oh no. Look, I think there's something like beautiful and elegant about a curse word. Like the right curse. I love cursing. Like with the right way. Like you can like light something up in this beautiful way.
I think I left one curse word in, and like I feel like it was the right one to keep in.
No. Like sometimes you have to like have your F-bombs, but then you already right way.
Yes.
So like for you, the voice was like whatever.
Yes.
But like it was like you switched genres.
Yes. So.
Because it was sort of, I remember when I don't know if I asked you first or I talked to Danielle. Danielle, I was just gonna keep it.
Yeah.
I think she was like I think I did talk to her and she was like, like Ashley's been wanting to write fantasy, and I was like, oh.
But I still feel like I like barely skimmed the surface.
I was like a vampire. Or maybe like that was the whole thing about me. It's like I actually write, and it was just funny because I was like struggling with my story, and I was like, how am I gonna write this story? And then I was like, I'm just gonna write, like for me tapping them in my voice, I was just like, I'm just gonna write like 16, 17-year-old Patrice, and I was like, vampire like movies and books everywhere in the room.
I was wondering if that was like your ideal like meet cute. I was like reading it and I was like,
this is where she wants to meet
literally like
the love of her life.
This is like so much wish fulfillment. Like literally, like there's a whole scene where she goes and she's like, her room's like covered in all this like vampire like stuff, and that was not my room. My room was covered in Padme, Queen Amidala stuff. So like I mean, it was like pretty nerdy, but like my dad was like really into Blade and all that stuff. And like later, like I started. So I feel like for me, especially since like Anne Rice, like when you're younger and you're like, you're not supposed to be reading, you kind of have that feeling that you're probably not supposed to be reading something, but you do it anyway. That was me with Anne Rice's books. Like, I knew there was stuff that I missed. And then recently I went back and reread them, and there was a lot that I missed at 13. So,
but like, it's funny how how your mind just like skips over those things if you're not ready for them.
There were things I read that I was like that definitely like some wild sex scenes, and I was like, wow, I like totally missed that, I
realized that a lot of my sort of issues root from that age group.
No, they totally do.
And so I think that I'm always trying to rewrite things that happened to me,
I feel like
and make different decisions and like pivot. And so it's very easy for me to get in that headspace because I'm kind of always in that headspace.
Yeah. Well, it's like once an emo kid, you're always an emo kid. So
oh,
you're just
yeah,
like,
totally.
I feel like I'm always like super emotional.
Yeah, I'm very emotional.
Listen,
I'm always
my wife put
about
in like the astrological, she texted my mother to find out what time I was born the other day.
Sad.
So like, was like, you're like triple Cancer and a Pisces. I was like, all I heard is that I cry a lot. That's literally all I heard.
How was it different for you to be an author versus being an editor? Because that is sort of that is the space that you were in before.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because I think, part of the other thing about putting this together was like, what would you have wanted when you were younger? And then I was like, oh, I think I would just take all the people who I'm actually fans of, Like you guys, I mean, one of you could have written a story that I hated.
That did cross my mind many times.
You're like, is Patricia being nice? And I'm like, I love it.
Me sitting there being like, I have to press send. My wife being like, press send.
It was like so cool, like the like diversity within it, which is great because that's what it should be, Right. I want to make sure we're getting like Latinx and Black people and like Native and Black people, I want to make sure that it's not just like, like Black Americans from Southern, especially since I have a lot of Southern roots, so I feel like that's very easy for me. And I love how you get all these different elements. Like I like how, Liz's is like, oh, it's like a slave revolt. And I was like, I love this because it's so empowering and it has magic, Yeah. Julie says that like ends it, it's like a Black Mirror-esque thing, which has felt so different. And then Karen Strong's story, like I will never forget when I got to a certain point in her story. It's like about this boo hag who is like basically like killing all the men in the village, and all you know is the main character, like this like creature has like killed the person she loves, and she's pregnant, and you're like, oh man, this is like bad. And there's like this twist that I actually screamed. I was like in the middle of a WeWork, and I'm probably sure I can never go back again. Like I just screamed because it was like chills, and so I love how there's like horror elements. Rebecca Roanhurst has like a wild west thing that's like, but also like a deal with the devil. Like I just think these are like so freaking cool. And I'm really curious, like, what are books you're reading right now? What are you like? What have you just read? What are you reading? Don't think about it. Just hit me.
So I have a few. Okay.
Oh my God, of
And
course.
I feel
Can
like
you ask a book, like an author, like
Sorry.
for one book rec?
I feel like a lot of these are not out yet, but they are
Okay.
coming out soon,
Okay,
so
okay,
I
cool.
think it's okay. Now That I Found You by Christina Forrest.
Oh my God,
I had to. Christina asked me to blurb it, which I was, delighted to do. That book is adorable.
Pitch it.
It is a Hollywood starlet it girl who gets sort of ousted of the industry by her best friend sort of betraying her, and then she goes to New York to try to convince her grandmother, who is was a super famous actress in her heyday, to okay her remaking the movie that made her grandmother famous. Ooh. And then her grandmother goes missing. So it is.
Whoa, that's like layers.
It is, but it's also like it has all of that, right?
Cute.
But it's adorable.
I am about halfway through Toshi's new release, The Riot Baby,
Oh, that book is good.
which is just.
That is like.
It's another one of those books on my list of. I started reading it, and I was like, oh, we can do that.
Yeah.
Like
It's like dystopian and like historical, and it's like all these like a genre mashups.
So like for me, emotionally, it is like take like Firestarter, but with the tone of when after like the
you
beginning
totally
of
work in a bookstore.
at the beginning of Black Panther, after the original myth like story is done, and then suddenly it just says Oakland on there and the music.
Oh, I love that's such a good way of pitching that. Okay, thank you all so much for listening to us. We really love this conversation. We got to talk about so many things, like our upbringings, how we basically all read the same books growing up, also about representation and magic, of course, and all the amazing stories in this anthology. A Phoenix First Must Burn, available for purchase. Thank you for watching.